Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of our Net Zero Week. I'm Claire Price. I'm the sector lead in the built environment team here at BSI. I'm basically focusing mainly on sustainable construction, carbon management, lower carbon concrete, energy efficiency retrofit, and resilience and adaptation. So shall we do some housekeeping before we start? If we move to the next slide, thank you. So it is a listen-only webinar. It is being recorded, so it will be available on demand following the event. Please submit any questions via the Q&A function. And use the Q&A function as well if you have any technical problems, any difficulties, just let them know through the Q&A function what the issue is and they can help you out there. We will send out a feedback survey. We really do welcome your feedback, so please fill that in and send that back in to us. We'll be circulating a link to the recording of the webinar in due course. It is a CPD recognised webinar, so do let us know if you want your certificate when you're filling in your feedback survey. Okay, so let's kick off then. And I'd really want to say welcome to Net Zero Week. It's our fourth Net Zero Week, and it is always a popular series of events, series of webinars. And no wonder really, the pace of transition to net zero is accelerating. 2030 is thundering towards us. 2050 won't be very far behind. And there still seems so much to do, not just reducing carbon, and I know many organisations are grappling with carbon emissions, especially scope 3 emissions, but also the state of nature. It's very much depleted. UK species have declined about 19% on average since 1970. Many species are now threatened with extinction. So increasing biodiversity is also essential. And there's been a lot happening on that this year. And we'll have a session on that this afternoon. So we do need to stop emissions, reduce emissions, but we also need to adapt to climate change itself, which is already with us, of course. We need to build resilience to shocks from climate change impacts if we want to sustain our way of life. Adaptation and resilience require systems thinking. Organisations can't operate in isolation. Collaboration is needed, and we need to share information along our supply chains and even with competitors for mutual benefit. And overarching all of this, I would say, is nature-based solutions, which are absolutely essential. As IUCN says, nature-based solutions for both mitigation and adaptation serve as an integral piece of the required global response for climate action. And that's because they can address climate change in three ways. They can help to decrease greenhouse gas emissions that are related to deforestation and land use. They can help with the capture and storage of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, for example, through restoring wetlands. And they can help to enhance resilience of ecosystems, which is so important. And so they can help societies to adapt to climate hazards such as flooding, sea level rise, and these more frequent and intense droughts and floods, heat waves and wildfires that we've been seeing. But care is needed, and everything needs to work together. Everything really needs to be connected. Organisations need information in order to make the right decisions, to develop climate conscious solutions, and to communicate effectively. And standards can help provide some tools for doing that. Not all the answer, obviously, but they can be hugely important in the journey to net zero. So next slide, please. So the week itself is a cross-sector event. We're focusing on climate resilience and biodiversity net gain for the built environment today. Tomorrow is healthcare and net zero in the morning. We have energy data, digitalization and AI in the afternoon. Wednesday is transport and net zero. And then Wednesday afternoon is net zero planning for SMEs. And on Thursday morning, food systems towards net zero and nature positive. We'll have a bit more information on the dates and times on those at the end. And I believe that something has been circulated to you. So there is some information in the handout section with clickable links, so you can actually click through and book onto those webinar events throughout this week. So please do. I think it's a very good week that's lined up for us. But let's get on to this morning's session, Climate Resilience of UK Assets through Standardization. Most infrastructure assets that will be operating in 2055 have already been built. The National Infrastructure Commission's second National Infrastructure Assessment Report highlighted the importance of infrastructure resilience to increasing exposure from external shocks, such as the impacts from climate change. There is a real danger that if we don't invest enough, if we underinvest in resilience, the already significant costs arising from these impacts will continue to rise. There are a number of aspects to this complex problem, and obviously solutions are not simple. So we're going to be exploring that today. We'll look at the nature of the risk to assets, the data needed to address it, and some potential solutions and activities that are already ongoing in the standards world. So first up, we'll hear from Ed Beard from the National Infrastructure Commission, who'll be talking about, oh, can you go back, please? I'll just run through the agenda. Thank you. Thanks, Sanju. So first we'll hear from Ed Beard from the National Infrastructure Commission, who will be talking about the need for asset resilience. Then we'll hear from Phil Hodge from the Met Office. We'll be covering meteorological and new climate data that they've been developing. Alison Walker from HS2 will talk about standardizing adaptation pathways for infrastructure and the thinking that's going on at the moment around that. John Dora from Climate Sense, and he's also the chair of the IOAF, will be talking about international adaptation standards landscape, so existing standards now, both nationally and particularly internationally, and future standardization in that area. Then Abby Dorian, my colleague here at BSI, will run a panel session with the speakers and talk through delivering a resilient future. And then I'll pop up to say goodbye and just run through those events again that are coming up during the week. All right, I'm going to hand over now to Ed. So enjoy the session and thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Claire. And my name's Ed Beard. I'm an Assistant Director at the National Infrastructure Commission. I look after the environment sectors that we worry about, the economic infrastructure sectors, that's floods, water and waste. But I also worry about how the environment impacts on infrastructure and how infrastructure impacts on the environment. So that's where we've got resilience in mind. If we move on to the next slide, please. I'll say a little more about who the Commission are and what we do. The commissioners are appointed by government to provide independent expert advice on the UK's long-term infrastructure needs. So we look out over at least the next 30 years. And the purpose is to identify what needs are out there and make recommendations to government on how to address those needs and requirements. The Commission does this principally by a overall assessment of all 6 economic infrastructure sectors that it looks after. So that's in addition to floods, water and waste, digital, energy and transport. And it sets these out in its National Infrastructure Assessment. And the second one of those was published in October last year. And it looked at 3 broad themes of how you might group thinking about infrastructure. That was reaching net zero and particularly what you need to do around the energy system to get there. how to provide growth across all regions. We're an arm's length body of treasury effectively, so we always have an economic view of things as well, and that about economic infrastructure. And also we thought it was important to think about climate resilience and how to increase that over time. In addition to the overall assessment, we also, when asked by government, can do individual studies on particular issues. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll say a little more about that. One of those studies that we published in 2020 was around resilience, and it looked across all the economic infrastructure sectors that we worried about and thought about how assets in those sectors need to be made more resilient and the systems that those assets provide more resilient over time. So that set out our initial thinking on resilience. But we built on that in the second National Infrastructure Assessment in Chapter 4 that you see there, and most recently, last week in our publication that looked at actual standards and identifying some of the gaps that might be there between different infrastructure assets around the standards and the performance of systems. So if I move on to the next slide, I can say a little bit more about how the Commission has thought about resilience in the round. So we set out this framework that we felt captured all the bits of resilience you need to be thinking about. So that's anticipating and adapting your systems in the first place to recognize what pressures and what hazards they may need to stand up to and how you can develop them to do that. And that therefore allows them to resist and absorb as a system some of those impacts. But we know that always there's going to be some hazard that comes along that can beat the system. So then it's about how quickly you can recover and your system can recover from that, and you can re-provide supplies to consumers or whatever your infrastructure is doing. And the last part of the system is how you then transform. So you learn lessons and you take forward those lessons and look at how you improve things in the future. If we move on then to the next slide, please. So in NIA2, the second National Infrastructure Assessment, we built on, as I say, the report we originally did, and we said that by 2025, government should, working with the regulators and the sectors, publish a set of outcome-based resilience standards so that people understood in the different utilities what was expected of them in terms of customer service and how that can be provided going forwards. It was important that the regulators are involved in this because as part of the regulatory systems that govern either the economic regulation of the utilities or things like roads, you need to understand what it is you're trying to deliver in terms of standards. So that can be taken into account in the modelling that's done when you're working out what you can charge customers or others, the taxpayer, for that development. And that allows you to make sure that its resilience is properly being taken account of and you're not having arguments over how you do that in sort of on an individual basis. If we move on to the next slide, please. The reason we felt that this was an important thing to do was as soon as possible, and therefore by 2025, was because if you fail to set the standards and fail to have that discussion about standards, you're missing out on £400 billion worth of investment over the sectors that we worried about, and we've set out the different spending periods for those sectors. You're missing out on all that investment where you could have been taking resilience into account in an adequate way and therefore planning and most efficiently delivering that resilience over the time period. If you wait, as the government was minded to do in response to our original study, to 2030, you've missed out on all that investment. And we move on to the next slide, please. In terms of building on that and thinking about climate in particular, we felt that once you've understood the standards and levels of service that you're trying to deliver to your customers and how well you are already on the path to being resilient, you need to think about the future, and particularly the change that climate is bringing in terms of the pressures and hazards that the systems might face. And therefore we felt that once you set out your standards, that would give time for the different sectors to think about how in the future, in light of climate change, be it temperature changes or floods or other pressures that come to bear on their systems, how they can build and develop those systems so that they remain resilient, and most importantly, what that will cost. And that then will allow for a discussion of whether those levels of service are desirable or even affordable in the future, and if not, what you're going to do to address that. But at the very least, it allows people to understand what needs to be spent to maintain resilience in the future. And again, that can be built into the regulatory systems. If we move on to the next slide, please. So a little more coming out of our most recent report on resilient standards. As we said here, we were thinking about particularly customer outcome standards because those levels of service is ultimately what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes it's not helpful to be too prescriptive in terms of standards on what you're doing to achieve those, but rather let the different sectors understand what they're trying to achieve and the best pathway to get there and the best parts of their system that can be addressed to do that. But sometimes it is helpful, and we got feedback when we were discussing this with the different ranges of sectors, that it is good to have performance standards where then you're not having a constant sort of a discussion and putting a new business case forward to your appropriate regulator on why you think a particular level of system resilience is required and why you want to invest in a particular way. An example of that might be already that standards that exist on numbers of customers depending on given levels of energy infrastructure. And similarly, you could have something in water trying to avoid too many customers being dependent on a single supply. So you can look at ways of reducing risk there and increasing resilience. And the last is about how quickly you can recover from any hazard or impact that you've had once the system, or if the system has been beaten. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Why are standards important? Well, as I've said, they're very important for investment. You need to know what standards you're aiming for so that you can work out what you need to invest to get to those, and you have a better position when you're making the case to regulators and, as I say, not completely reinventing the wheel each time. Standards give certainty so people know, and consumers and the public know, what they can rely on in terms of a standard. And therefore they can adjust their lives accordingly because they'll know that in certain circumstances they may not expect that particular type of infrastructure to be still delivering. And also, if you have a good understanding of standards, you can address some of the independencies between different sectors. So if water is reliant on energy for pumping and moving water around, you can understand what level of resilience that energy system, the electricity system, is on, and that can factor into your planning. There's no point planning to have a water resist system that's more resilient than the electricity system that's providing it. And that's going to become more and more important as more and more types of infrastructure reliant on electricity. So if you think about transport as well, how it's fundamental to delivering that in the future, and also digital, where another aspect of interdependencies are very clear. So if we move on to the next slide, please. These then was thinking about the principles that the Commission identified that should be applied when discussions are being had about standards that should be delivered. And this ultimately, we feel these standards are for government to decide on, working with advice from the sectors and the regulators. But ultimately, if you're trying to make trade-offs, it is important that government is in the position to be making those trade-offs because it's got the democratic accountability. It can understand what it is that consumers and others expect of different infrastructure and therefore make that appropriate trade-off between what's affordable, what things cost, and what level of resilience you achieve. So these principles, the first one is common scenarios. So all those different sectors, you should be starting with the same sort of expectations, particularly with climate in mind, of what the world is going to look like in the future. And that way everyone's starting with the same baseline and planning accordingly, rather than different sort of assumptions about future scenarios and therefore thinking that they're delivering different levels of resilience in those contexts. So it's important to have some consistency. As I say, you've got to make trade-offs. Not everything's going to be affordable, and you may have a priority over which aspects of a system it's more important to be resilient than others. So you can make those trade-offs both at a system operator level, but also, I think, ultimately at a government level where, as I say, some of that social expectation can be taken into account most appropriately. We also think that, importantly, you mustn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And this is because if you do, then you're never going to get anywhere. You won't start filling in the gaps you might have around the standards you need to achieve because you're always waiting for that extra bit of data or that extra bit of information about how affordable things might be, and you don't go anywhere. So you've got to start the ball rolling. Otherwise, more time and more spending periods will pass by and we won't really have addressed some of these things, and we won't have looked to the future and invested early, which is probably a more efficient way of doing things. You've got to consider as wide a range of impacts as possible. We're focused very much on climate change here, but there obviously are lots of different ways that systems could be affected, and you need to think about those and address them accordingly. And again, you may be prioritizing which are the most important to address. You have got to understand what consumers are thinking. So you do need to do different approaches and methodologies to understanding the expectations of the consumer of your services and what level of resilience they might be expecting. But then importantly, in light of the level of resilience they want to achieve, how much that might cost and how much that will cost them as bill payers or taxpayers to get to that level of resilience. And that again is where we come back to the iterative process, that you may find that what you thought you wanted isn't really affordable, and you can adapt and accommodate that if you know what you're expecting to achieve. We need to be clear that there's probably a different approach for new build infrastructure, where it's probably easier to build in resilience to new standards because everything's new, than it is where you're retrofitting. But of course, a lot of the infrastructure around today will still be around in 30 years' time. So we've got to think about how you can adapt systems. So when you're renewing or otherwise adjusting parts of a system, you can think about the resilient standards you're trying to achieve over time and build that in. And again, that's going to be more efficient than having to come in and deliver specific resilience benefits late in the day and as a one task, rather than renewing or adapting systems over time as you maintain them. You've got to consider the standards collectively. That's both so that you can make those trade-offs and think about what are your priority levels of resilience and areas you need to invest in, but also looking again across sectors, making sure that you understand how expectations in one sector have an impact on the expectations and the ability to be resilient in other sectors as well. And you probably, in the last one, need to phase the introduction of standards. Again, this is about finding an affordable pathway to deliver increased resilience. We're the Commission, so we're thinking over a long-term period. Not everything's going to be achievable in one go in 5 years or whatever. You've got to build it into your thinking over the long term. But as I say, if you don't start now, you're going to find that you're not investing and identifying the standards you want to achieve in time, and we're going to really start to see perhaps some pressures from things like climate change impacting on systems and the delivery of service that has. I'll stop there and hand over to Phil. So thank you very much for listening.
Good morning, everybody. I think the system is feeling like me on a Monday morning doing a presentation when I haven't quite had enough coffee. My name is Phil Hodge. I am part of the Met Office. I have been with the Met Office for about 5 years. Well, actually 5 years last week. So as far as the Met Office is concerned, I'm probably a toddler. We do tend to have a lot of lifers, a lot of people who stick around for a very, very long time. So my role is part of the energy team, although I do tend to dabble in other things as well. And in particular, being proactive in engaging with the energy sector in terms of what we're doing and in terms of supporting not only the sort of modelling, supply and demand modelling and all that sort of stuff, but also more proactively supporting the incredible investment that's going on in new build and upgrading infrastructure. And that's really where I'm sort of coming from. So I'm hopefully going to deal with my slides properly. So I want to take you back a step. I could talk quite a bit about what we're doing in extreme events and resilience type work and data we're doing that, which hopefully we're doing in the energy sector, but hopefully will benefit way beyond the energy sector. So the issues around climate data for infrastructure and things like that. But I'm going to leave that for another time because I want to take a step back into not quite the ice age, but into ice, where my journey with this began. Although previous lives I've spent working a lot with regulation and standards, not within the energy sector. So I think it's probably fair to say for most of us, we don't really care about the weather forecast, apart from geeks and meteorologists. What we care about is what it means in terms of making decisions. And those decisions are often immediate, like it's absolutely throwing it down outside my house this morning. So I managed to get my wife to take the dog for a walk rather than me, by making the excuse I had a seminar this morning. So she got wet and I didn't. I will pay for that later. But really it's that decision-making process. And where we started with this was with looking at the ice accretion standards. And we were doing some work with SSE and transmission in Scotland around dynamic line rating. And they started talking about the ice and the fact that they were trying to figure out what the ice load should be on some of their engineering designs for the Western Isles. And you can see on the map on the left, it's a little bit difficult to figure out where the lines start and finish and where the gaps are. And so we had a look at these and realized, yeah, they were developed over probably 30 years ago in reality. They were devised using the best science and data available at the time. There has been some attempts to update it since, and some good work was done, even people in the Met Office, but it hasn't really been adopted. So we had this very old data, which was making decision making very difficult, and in reality, it's really past its sell-by date, and past the fact that it's usable data. So we needed to address this, and so we talked to SSE, and the idea was to really come up to do it again, to start again a little bit, not just to update the old and just redo what we'd done before, but really look at it again. But we still had to do this to be compliant with the existing standards. There's no point producing data that either is no use within the existing standards and equally not usable easily by engineers and the engineering processes. So we need to consider how we create new data, how we redo the science or check the science and make sure it's appropriate still, because a lot of learning has been done since then, that it is appropriate for the standards are safe for the engineers to use, that it's digitalized so it's actually usable in the real world as we do today. So this is what we did, but we obviously had to also make sure that, if we're creating new values, then they are both safe and, where appropriate, well, they're as accurate as possible. And there's always this balance between science and engineering. Science would always like to spend a lot more time and a lot more money doing everything a little bit more perfect. And engineering, is built on engineering tolerances. So there's always that balance between the two. So what did we end up with? Well, after quite a bit of work and a lot of engagement between the scientists, a lot of nice playing around with different data sets and doing all sorts of clever stuff with bias corrections and modeling and all that, we ended up going from one old map to about a dozen digitalized maps on a much more granular scale, which were capable of being loaded into ArcGIS, capable of being using within the design systems and not having to stare at bits of paper, but also took account of the fact that transmission lines are at different heights, different altitudes, that conductors are different sizes, and that makes a difference to the ice. So from one map, we created about a dozen. And this taught us an awful lot about doing this sort of, it's not simply just about renewing the data. A lot of you in the audience today will probably be very aware that the data that is in a lot of the standards, meteorological data that's in a lot of standards is not ideal and is probably past its sell-by date. But where we learned from is that it's not simply about renewing that and just doing the same old stuff again. Partly because science has moved on, because data has moved on, because computing power has moved on, because our understanding of things has moved on, there's an awful lot more we have to do and we can do to produce much better data than we've had in the past to help the decision-making process. So, as I say, does it matter? Well, I'm not going to start quoting figures, but I think what is clear from the work done with SSE on this, and we're also doing work on other standards in different ways with SSE and a bit with National Grid, is that it matters in terms of costs because it reduces a lot of over-engineering. It matters in terms of making sure things are still safe, but it also matters, in terms of the amount of steel that's been used, the amount of foundations that are concrete that's been used. So it matters beyond simply the consumer bill, but into the wider environmental question as well. But it does take a lot of effort and time. It's not simply a case of doing one thing quickly and just replacing a simple map or a bunch of data and leaving it there. Now, what we need to do is consider obviously the climate impact. Now with ice, there's a bit of an assumption that, you know, the weather's generally the global warming, so we're not going to get warmer and see more ice, but the reality is we'll probably see more extreme weather events, so it's probably not going to necessarily get any better. So in this particular case at the moment, although there will be a more robust review, that we're taking the view that we need to just have a process by which we know when a data set like this should be re-looked at in relation to what's happening in the climate at a particular time. But so we have quite a lot, we've done sort of quite a lot in that respect. Now, is my thing moving forward? No, my slides have seem to have stuck, which is going to be interesting. So, but what I'd say is that where we got to from there, I'll carry on talking, is really only the tip of the iceberg. I think all of you know, sorry, I'm taking back control and I'm hoping that it's going to work, but it's not. It's really the tip of the iceberg. I think most of you who are aware of this topic know that the data, as I said before, the data is pretty, there we go, is outdated, and there's an awful lot of work to do. And there is a lot of sort of cries for, can we please have some decent data from the Met Office? And this is what we plan to do. So what we're hoping to do, we will be working and talking to the BSI for quite a while, and it's frozen again by the looks of it. And what we're planning to do is kick off in, now here we go. Later on in October, we're having a workshop, and fortunately it's invited people only, because I think we might have got a lot of people interested in this topic who want to have their say. But it's been invited only with the key players to look at, okay, we know we've learned a lot from doing the ice map. We've learned a lot from doing a few other pieces of work. We've learned a lot from doing a little bit of research, and you know, we've done some work with lightning and such. So we need to figure out, we know a lot of what we need to do, but we need to do a lot more work. So both from the point of view of the Met Office, we need to understand the full scope of what's required. So understand all the various things that we need to be doing in terms of meteorological data, and then how we're going to address the climate data piece within these within the standards. BSI itself needs to figure out, well, we've got a lot of work to understand, well, okay, if we do all this updating of data, how do we get that data to be accepted within the standards without, you know, having to update the standards? Because obviously there's a process for that, but it can take quite a while, and that's the way it goes. So we're looking to address this. We're looking to come up with a proposal of how we do this by the end of the year, and then we'll be submitting that to the relevant authorities to see if we can get some funding to do this work and do it in a timely manner, but it's not going to be quick. So as I say, I could have talked more about resilience, but I wanted to go back to the technical asset standards, because that's really the foundation of everything else. Without addressing those, there will always be challenges with addressing resilience. So we need to get these sorted, as well as and alongside developing the resilience standards. So that is me finished, and I think I'm handing over to Alison.
Hi, yes, I'm just trying to take control of the slides. Thanks, Phil. That was a really interesting presentation, and it touches on some of the things that I'm going to go through in my slides too. Hi, everyone. I'm Alison Walker. I'm Climate Change Manager at High Speed 2, and I'm also a member of BSI's Climate Change Adaptation Subcommittee. To give some background for those unfamiliar with the project, HS2 is the first new intercity railway to be built north of London in over a century. Construction is well underway. We're employing 28,000 people, roughly, bringing together the best of British design and engineering. HS2 comprises of 140 miles of track, 11 miles of viaducts, 65 miles of tunnels, and 4 stations. That's our statistics. And it's being built to the high standards that will leave a legacy of environmentally responsible travel, economic regeneration, and technological innovation. Now, climate change is one of the greatest challenges that our society in general faces. In terms of even a new railway, such as HS2, potential climate impacts range from delays to our construction and operations, safety issues for passengers and staff, direct infrastructure damage, and the associated costs with all of these. I'm going to focus in this presentation on how we've tackled and responded to this challenge, the work that we're doing both internally and with others in relation to standards, what we've learnt and how this relates to work on standardising adaptation pathways for infrastructure. So I'm just going to skip over that slide. Or maybe not. It's not frozen for me. That's the right slide. As can be seen in this photo, our infrastructure is brand new, which creates a unique opportunity. Armed with the knowledge of future climate projections, we've built in climate resilience at every step of HS2, from planning, designing and constructing the railway and its surrounding environment, to integrating climate resilient thinking into future operations and maintenance plans. HS2 is being designed to operate well into the 22nd century, so we have to be prepared for our changing climate. Because even given global efforts to reduce carbon, as everyone will know, there's still inevitable changes to our climate in the future, including warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers, and as Phil's just talked about, more extreme weather. So how do we do this? At the project outset, HS2 undertook a high-level climate change resilience assessment as part of our environmental assessments at the planning and consent stage. And this was really important. It's the first for a major infrastructure project at the time, and it sort of set the tone of the work that we were going to do in the future. One early example of embedding climate resilience was our approach to flood resilience. We aim to minimise the risk of flooding through the initial route selection by building bridging structures and viaducts. So you can see in the photo, that's the one over the River Cole. And raising track elevation where needed. We also embedded the requirement for high flood resilience standards for critical infrastructure very early on, which was a step change to other infrastructure projects. And climate resilience has also been embedded into our design processes. HS2 is designed in line with our standards, which are typically based on best practice British and international engineering codes. We found that engineering standards are often based on historical weather forecasts or do not consider climate change, and Phil's already gone through some of the issues with that. Where needed, we've adapted these standards to embed our desired levels of climate resilience into them, creating some bespoke design standards, including one specifically for climate adaptation. This process ensures that our designs, as far as practicable, maximise resilience to climate change and also maximises the potential for adaptation to climate change in the future, and also minimises the loss of performance, as we've heard already in terms of resilience standards from the NIC. An example of that is that we've adapted our design requirements to include a climate allowance into our bridge design basis. This accounts for climate change in the sizing of expansion joints on our structures. All of our stations have been designed with environmental sustainability and climate resilience in mind. We use the industry recognised environmental sustainability rating standard, BREEAM, and have set minimum requirements for our designers and contractors. This includes specifically obtaining credits for climate resilience at our stations. The designs for two of our stations, Old Common and Interchange, have both been awarded certification, putting them in the top 1% of buildings for eco-friendly credentials. And you can see a couple of examples of how we've included climate resilience measures on the slide. For example, at Interchange, the innovative roof design allows rainwater to be captured for recycling, reducing our water demand, and it also increases our resilience to droughts. Climate change resilience extends beyond the grey infrastructure of HS2. The Green Corridor programme will create the equivalent of around 33 square kilometres of new wildlife habitats along the railway. It aims to create a network of bigger, better connected, climate resilient habitats and new green spaces for people and wildlife. The measures to increase resilience in the Green Corridor include designing connected habitats so that wildlife is able to migrate as needed, increasing the species diversity, looking at the provenance of trees and specifying trees from some trees from more southerly provenance, integrating climate adaptation into management plans. The co-benefits, I think Claire talked about this earlier, was of planting new trees and creating habitats include capturing and storing carbon, reducing temperatures, improving air quality, reducing flooding and helping wildlife to move more freely. It will also help to improve rivers and other aquatic environments. So we've already set out climate change is happening now, and recent extreme weather events have really highlighted this. Over the last few years, we've seen a lot of extreme weather. For example, in 2022, we had extreme temperatures of over 40 degrees. The most recent winter and spring have been one of the wettest on record. Many of our construction activities, such as concrete pours and lifting operations, are directly affected by our weather and climate, with implications for cost, safety and programme. We've got a few on the slide here. We've therefore embedded consideration of climate change into our construction period too, with a focus on managing extreme weather events in our code of construction practice, which sets out a series of principles for the management of extreme weather. These include the use of weather forecasting and alert systems in programme management, increasing resilience to extreme weather events. HS2 and our contractors are also supporting innovative technologies to create a step change in proactive management of weather during the construction period. One of our contractors, Align, has been working with a startup to use AI and machine learning to understand weather forecasting better and optimise forecasts for project management to minimise downtime whilst increasing safety. For example, here you can see the Colne Valley Viaduct, and the emphasis for the original work was on wind speed, because the girder that you can see will lift 1,000 giant concrete deck segments onto the piers that have already been constructed. Each segment weighs around 140 tonnes, or about the weight of 20 elephants. So you can understand why the equipment is very sensitive to wind speed. More details on this innovation can be found in our recent HS2 Learning Legacy podcast, which also has information on some of the work that we're doing on carbon. And our work in this space continues as we look ahead to operations. We're making sure to embed climate considerations into our operational planning and maintenance activities. We're actively capturing our lessons learned from our design and construction programme, with a view to using those in our operational planning. And if you want to find out a bit more about what HS2 has been doing in this space, well, there's the podcast that I mentioned, but there are also some other useful resources. In 2021, HS2 completed the first adaptation reporting power report for a standalone project that's still in the design and construction phase. And as part of our HS2 Learning Legacy, we're also sharing how we're already embedding climate change adaptation and resilience into HS2 and the lessons that we are learning, which are both pertinent to new and existing infrastructure. Our general learning and opportunities are set out in these documents, but I'd like to emphasise that designing and building new infrastructure or enhancing existing infrastructure, as both Phil and Ed set out, is an opportunity to embed climate resilience, but needs to be done, in my view, early on in the process. And as we've set out, HS2 have integrated climate adaptation and resilience into our standards, our systems, our governance and reporting. That's also key. Our challenges in terms of climate change and standards are again, as we've already heard, many international and UK design standards and guidelines are very old in terms of the information that they have on historic weather, and climate allowances are out of date. We've adapted our standards where we felt that we needed to, and obviously design standards and guidelines are periodically updated. But in some cases, we'd have to assess the implications of the changes to climate data standards and guidelines to work out whether additional allowances or modifications need to be made to our design. We've already heard that there is no specific guidance on which climate change scenarios should be used to prepare for climate change. HS2 has addressed this by considering a range of climate scenarios in our environmental assessments and design, and we use sensitivity testing where applicable. There is also uncertainty and information gaps relating to climate variables such as wind and snow, making it difficult to design and construct assets with long lifetimes. But there is a solution, or one type of solution, which is climate change adaptation pathways. So one way to address some of these challenges and the related uncertainty to aid proper decision making is adaptation pathways. As I've said, climate change will increasingly put pressure on transport networks and infrastructure, and I've shown how HS2 is a proactive approach to adaptation, but we've also identified challenges and opportunities. And assets and systems of any business can remain vulnerable to inherent uncertainties associated with climate change, as well as uncertainty with the long time periods associated with climate projections and the assumptions that have been made at the design stage, including those standards that might already be out of date. So how do we manage these uncertainties and make the right decisions, for example, when and how to upgrade infrastructure or change the way we manage infrastructure to ensure optimization of assets in a changing climate? Well, one way is through adaptation pathways, which are a growing decision-making approach that can help provide businesses with the flexibility needed to continue building resilience over the long term. A great example of a standardization in this space is BS 8631 2021, Adaptation to Climate Change, using adaptation pathways for decision making, which is its full title. The standard sets out the process for anticipating the future and developing a strategy to future-proof it. The standard sets out a 9-step process, as shown in the slide. It's likely to not be a one-off course of action, though, and it could well be ongoing as better information and more certainty over the future feeds into the process. A notable example of using climate change adaptation pathways in infrastructure is the Environment Agency's Thames Estuary 2100 project. The major flood risk project looks at climate change adaptation as the core piece of the project. It covers the entire 109 kilometres of the Thames Estuary, all the way from Teddington Lock in West London to the river mouth at Southend-on-Sea. And it details how 1.42 million people and £321 billion of property and infrastructure will be protected from flooding beyond the year 2100. It's a really fantastic example of the use of adaptation pathways on a very grand scale. However, although there are these examples of using adaptation pathways and they're growing, there is an acknowledgement that there is a space for more granular guidance on the use of adaptation pathways for infrastructure and to build on the standard BS 8631. This is to help ensure that the right decisions are made for infrastructure in a changing climate in a structured way. Having put this forward to the Institute of Civil Engineers, ICE is now sponsoring a publicly available standard, or PAS, on adaptation pathways for infrastructure. There have already been discussions with British Standards on this, which is why I'm speaking today, and a number of organisations have come forward with funding and others are in the pipeline. The PAS will build on BS 8631. There is currently very little other methodology and case studies to address adaptation pathways for infrastructure, and there are a few examples of how to practically implement the pathways approach, other than at this very high level on large scale schemes like the TE 2100 Thames Estuary project. They're also quite expensive, those types of projects. The proposal is for a PAS and associated guidance for case studies to address this gap. HS2 is starting to develop our own case studies on adaptation pathways and is also supporting the development of this BSI publicly available standard. If you'd like further information on this PAS, please contact Billy Donovan at ICE. There's still the opportunity for further interested organisations or stakeholders to support this PAS and contribute to the development. I hope you enjoyed this insight into the adaptation and resilience work and associated adaptation standards work that HS2 is doing, and the information on standardization of adaptation pathways for infrastructure and its role in improving decision making in a changing climate. Thanks, and I'll hand over to John Dora.
Hello, I'm John Dora. I'm a director at Climate Sense and chair of the UK's Infrastructure Operators Adaptation Forum, which brings together about 70 organisations, including regulators and the major players in infrastructure in the UK. For a number of years now, I've been working with international standards, and I've led the sort of development of ISO 14090, the first ISO on climate change adaptation, and I still take an active role with ISO leading their adaptation standard strategy. I work also with Sensenlec in Europe on standards development for climate adaptation, and I'm a member of the BSI Committee on Climate Adaptation as well. So why standards? Well, standards, among other things, provide an ordered way of doing things, written by professionals, recognised professionals in a specialist topic area that help to demonstrate good practice to third parties and others. I like standards because by following standards, we tend to have a politically agnostic way of dealing with things like climate change, and they provide a recognised benchmark for use amongst many organisations to produce material, goods, products, activities and services that provide consistent results to an agreed set of terminology. International standards, ISO, we have a number of committees. There's hundreds of committees at ISO, and Technical Committee TC207 covers environmental management, and SC7 is one of the subcommittees within TC207, and there's about 9 of them. But SC7 deals with greenhouse gas and climate change management and related activities, including adaptation. They're linked with other technical committees like TC292, which looks at things like urban sustainability, and 251, which looks at asset management. There are various things outside these committees like Guide 84 on addressing climate change and standards, and the London Declaration that was signed at the time of the Glasgow COP about 3 years ago. Within SC7, we've got ISO 14090 adaptation to climate change and supporting documents like 1491, 1492 and 1493. 1491 provides guidelines on vulnerability impacts and risk assessments, going into much more detail than ISO 14090 has. 14092 similarly goes into more detail specifically for local governments and communities, so it's a kind of sector specific standard, and 14093 looks at resilience grants, climate resilience grants, which is aimed mainly at the global south. In context, these kind of fit together to support the United Nations SDGs, as we see on the left, and we have strategy groups that look at adaptation and mitigation. TG2, the strategy group on adaptation, is chaired by myself, and we've been looking at these standards at the top right, developing those and looking ahead to see what other standards we may require. Mitigation standards, there's a whole series of quantification and verification standards on greenhouse gas management, and there are some standards that cross over both adaptation and mitigation, such as 1480 and 1497. So ISO, TC207, SC7, TG2 is where we develop the strategy for international standards in the long term. The current state of play with these standards, we have ISO 14090, which was published in 2019, and we've just had its 5-yearly systematic review, which suggests it might need a revision, but owing to resources, that might not happen for a couple of years. Hopefully next year we'll get into revising 14,090, bringing in some of the new learning we've had since it was first published. 14,091 potentially will be revised in a couple of years' time as it goes through its review, and 14,092 is already being reviewed, led by our friends in Japan. In BSI, interestingly enough, we have BS 8631, and Alison earlier on talked about adaptation pathways in terms of BS 8631 and the paths which are mentioned here, the publicly available specification, which will be drafted in the next year or so. That actually supports 8631 in a sector-specific way for infrastructure, and will have a complementary guide with case studies. And as Alison said, that's something that's being pulled together in the funding realm by the Institution of Civil Engineers, and we're working with BSI to get funding together and set up a committee to draft this paths over the next year or so. Just to note as well, BS 8631, we have sort of emerging plans to make this an ISO standard, possibly in 2026, but we just see how resources go and how BSI take that forward with ISO and our Committee on Adaptation Standards Strategy. In CEN-CENELEC in Europe, I've left a link here on the right, which would be quite useful for some of you that look at infrastructure standards. There's a 2.5-year project run by German Standards DIN with a number of tasks there, and I'm the technical lead for this program. I'm very proud to be doing that because I've worked in this field with CEN-CENELEC with Netherlands standards since about 2016, so this work seems to continue. But one of the tasks is to merge the CEN Guide 32, which is product focused, and some tailored guidance, which is linked through by the QR code there, which are both guides for standards writers. The tailored guidance was drafted mainly by my colleague Dougie Black, and that's part of it for standards writers. On the other hand, we've been asked in this contract to introduce a technical report, which is kind of second level, third level standard for standard users on data sourcing. And I drafted an outline for this in the previous contract, and we're taking that up to a full technical report over the next year. And if anybody wants to get involved in that drafting, do get in touch with me, because we could do with some more experts on the drafting group. And the technical report kind of fits with standards users, the tailored guidance in CEN Guide 32 on standards writers, and there's a kind of crossover here in terms of climate services, which I'll get onto in a minute. But another major part of this contract, this 2.5-year project, is to modify some European standards to build in climate adaptation needs. And the previous work that we were involved in worked on some standards, about 13, 14 standards. Now we want to look at others. Last year, the European Commission identified over 350 standards out of 24,000, I think it was, in Europe through a kind of triage exercise that will need some work as regards resilience building by changing these standards. They were filtered to 78 priorities from 10 different technical committees, and we hope to work on some of these standards over the next couple of years using the tailored guidance to help standards writers draft in the right sort of text to help standards users in the longer term. And one of the exercises we're doing in this work is to modify the tailored guidance and merge it with CEN Guide 32, so as it becomes a one-stop shop for looking at guidelines for drafting standards. Again, in CEN-CENELEC, there's a request from the European Commission to ask CEN-CENELEC to draft a climate services standard for adaptation. Now, this has come out of Europe, but the UKRI, in the research programme under UKRI, a climate services standard was drafted by me and my colleagues, which could become a seed document for this European standard. And there's a QR link there to the UKRI climate services standard, which is something that could be used as a stopgap, can be used now, it's free to access, and that can help people procure climate services. It can help climate services providers in having a dialogue with potential clients to make sure that the services are used and set up commensurate with the complexity of the problems at hand by the clients needing climate services. Climate services are fundamental to drafting standards and also for using standards, as both need that kind of expertise. And I've got a philosophical thought here. Should the standard give the detail of all the climate relevant parameters that the user can just refer to, or should the standards user establish these? Now that's a discussion we're having in Sensenelec just now. And of course, if the infrastructure being built is place-based, it's very important factors at a location that need to be thought about, and how can you assemble climate data relevant to that place, relevant to life cycles and so on and so forth. So there's some thoughts there, as well as things like we think about in Europe, such as cross-border issues and consistency on either side of that border for maybe linear on infrastructure like railways or pipelines or roads. So looking across the world at different standards, I did an exercise a few years ago, 2020, for the Asian Development Bank, where the documents outlined in black writing here were listed in a report for ADB on resilience, international, USA, China, Australia, European standards. This exercise was, like I said, 4 years ago. And the bank, Asian Development Bank, asked me to update that list with another report this year. And this is where the standards and guidelines in red have come from. And you can see that a quick study that I carried out has shown a proliferation of adaptation and resilience type standards, because this kind of crossovers into the disaster risk reduction area, which is kind of driven by the UNDRR people. So lots of standards have popped up over the few years since 2020. Looking at resilience, you can see technical codes for climate resilient urban infrastructure in China. The Sensenelec program that I just mentioned about various infrastructure standards. Australia looking at structural design actions, wind actions, and bringing in climate factors into those as well. So lots here on a global scale. Again, here's another set of standards, British standards. We've mentioned already BS 8631 about adaptation pathways, but there's much going on at a sector-specific level. You can see here PINC, which is the International Association for Ports and Inland Waterways. They produce quite a few guidelines on climate adaptation, including dealing with uncertainties, making business cases, which has been published now, and updates on climate data, which is all useful source material. Airports, the ICAO has published a report on climate change and risk assessment and adaptation and resilience. PARC, which is the International Roads Federation, have covered approaches to resilience for climate change and other hazards. All these documents are really useful to sector-specific organizations. Rail Adapt in 2018. UIC, the International Union of Railways, is working on guidelines for rainfall, flooding, heat and drought at the moment to help the international railway community to bring in good practice. So there's lots of standards around, and this is only a selection of these. They're very useful guideline documents. Some, like the ISO standards, have mandatory shall requirements in them. Others are guidelines that actually help people find their way through making to make roadmaps to produce adaptation plans and to get on top of the resilience needs in infrastructure in the long term. Thank you. I think that's the quick run through my slides that were presented on Monday, the 23rd of September. There's a couple of links in here for Climate Sense, the company I work for. We provide services around climate decision making being key to understanding and producing good adaptation long-term plans. And there's another link there to some capacity development software that we produce that helps, again, decision makers in how they approach adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all of our speakers. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on climate resilience for UK assets through standardization. My name is Abby Dorian, and I'm the Energy Sector Lead here at BSI. Once again, thank you to all of our panelists, and if I could ask you to turn on your cameras. We've heard a range of perspectives about how standardization can contribute to climate resilience, as well as how emerging technologies are shaping the way we think about adaptation. Now, for the next section of today's webinar, we're going to be taking a bit more of a deeper dive into some of the key topics of the discussions and areas of concern when we are thinking about climate resilience. I encourage our online audience to make use of the Q&A function, pop any of your questions in there, and time permitting, we will come to them. Alternatively, we can reach out after today's webinar session. So just to get us kicked off, I think it's always helpful to address a very persistent question that we get from industry. In terms of requirements for resilience in a very rapidly changing context and climate conditions, it can be very complex for end users to navigate. How can government departments and enforcement agencies more effectively integrate and enforce climate resilience standards in conjunction with existing legislation? And I think I'll come to you first on this one.
Hi, thank you, Abby. I think we've heard how technically difficult it is to establish the standards and that they're evolving. So I think the key thing is perhaps that everyone has to accept their different roles. So I think there are the technical standards and there's understanding the cost of delivering those standards, but there's also then the public, willingness to pay to deliver those standards. And I think therefore politicians probably have a role in taking and understanding the public mood of what can be achieved. And then they need to support the regulators with sort of political cover so that they can then, through the regulatory systems, have standards that have been agreed with sectors and work to delivering those standards. And I think the other key point I would probably say is going back to the point that the Commission made about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. You've got to accept that things will evolve. I think we've heard how certainty over data points may increase over time. But if you keep waiting and waiting for everything to be in place, then you end up risking doing nothing when actually you need to start acting now. So you work on the best information you've got, but you accept that people have different responsibilities, but you need a supportive framework so that all can play their role.
That was a great point. And I think during your presentation, particularly the statement the government needs to take a step forward and just take on the resilience challenge really resonated with me. Phil, maybe I can come to you next on that question. You have a real wealth of experience working with legislation and standardization on their shared role in informing better decision making when it comes to resilience. Can I pick your brain on how legislation standardization can perhaps work better together and shape more considered adaptation strategies and practices?
Yeah, if I speak from the Met Office side of things first, what our role is, I think, is to provide better data. And I think, the way the standards are drafted, the way the legislation is drafted, in a sense, is not a Met Office problem as such, but providing the quality of data is. And when we look across a lot of the work that's gone on, the data it's based on is not the best data that could be made available. And that, I think, is where it starts. I think after that, it's what I've heard today is, Alison's talked about what they've done in HS2 to adapt to things. What I've heard from John is the various work that's going on across Europe and different pieces of work he's been involved in. I know the work that we've been involved in with energy, but everybody's doing it, not totally with what John's doing, obviously, but we're all doing it in a little bit of isolation. And as far as the UK is concerned, I think one of the things that we want to try and do, and we've set up a sort of informal group between DESNES, Ofgem, and various other groups to look at how we can make sure there is some sort of standardization commonality again in the data side, so that everybody's starting off from the same point. Because people in some cases are using historic data to worry about what's going to happen in the future, and that just doesn't make sense. So I'm going to be boring and keep saying data, data, data. we've got a big supercomputer that's capable of doing a lot of stuff. We need to take advantage of it and make sure that what we're providing to people is the right data. So whoever then creates the standards, whoever then does the work, is basing it on the right foundation in the first place, and there's consistency in that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I don't think that's a boring input to think about the consistency and actual relevance of the data that we're using when we're developing these policies or standards as an enabling framework. Alison, you spoke a lot about HS2 and the proactive approach in terms of actually adapting the underlying standards so that they're more fit for purpose in terms of thinking about resilience. Do you have any thoughts in terms of the interaction between how requirements and standards can better interact for a more resilient world? Oh, we can't hear you, but you are not on mute. Perhaps I'll come back to you in a moment. I'll let our events team crash course that. John, you're up. If I can come to you, I mean, you've got a wealth of experience in terms of the development of standards so that they're fit for purpose and they're providing end users with the tools to make more informed decisions about how they can be resilient in their practices. How can standardization act as a complementary tool to regulation?
I think that the main point I'm thinking of here is some work that I did with JBA Consulting a couple of years ago for the UKRI program, which looked at how standardization can help policy makers. And one of the big conclusions we had that was that we need some good firm policy. There's not just guidance, but it's kind of mandated. People shall do things, have to do things. We have a series of guidelines in parts of the country just now that allow developers to ignore flood resilience guidelines because they make a case for it and they ignore things like we need firm sort of direction for government to say you have to do these things. Years ago, when I worked in flood risk management, I used to see new housing estates being flooded, and they'd been built in a floodplain against advice. It's still happening. And sometimes now they build, or very often now they build estates where the thresholds of the houses are above the flood level and the access roads are above the flood level. But we need to have sort of firm policy statements that everything else can hang off. Once you have a guideline rather than a firm mandated requirement, things tend not to happen. So standards can be used to support good policy, but the good policy's got to be there. And it comes back again to what I was making a point about, and I heard with people at Ed and Alison as well. The decision maker is key. The decision maker needs to understand the implications of the decisions they're making, looking at the longer term. And again, another sort of part of it, looking at standardization, is the adaptation pathway concept. Helps us get around uncertainty. We don't need the perfect data just now. We need to know what's going to happen, what's likely to happen, and then design around that so as we don't let perfection get in the way of building something and building it in a resilient way or a way that can be modified in the future through the adaptation pathway process. So that's about 3 or 4 points. I'll shut up because otherwise I'll be here longer.
No, it's a very interesting input. And I think an underlying theme here is sort of just getting on and getting it done and doing our best with what the information we have currently. If I can have a little bit of a step change to our next question, alongside sort of changing climatic conditions, we're also faced with a really rapidly evolving technological landscape with rapid advancements in things like smart technologies and materials. These are often changing far faster than the standards development process can keep up. So what are some of the best practices in terms of integrating emerging technologies into adaptation measures for different types of buildings and infrastructure? Alison, you brought up some interesting examples in terms of how contractors are using innovative technologies for a step change to better forecast and minimise downtime. If your mic is working, what are your best practices for integrating these measures into adaptation measures? Now let's see if it's on. I will circle back to you once we've crash coursed that. Maybe Ed, if I can come to you now. You made the specific point that effective asset management really does rely on effective digital tools and the implementation of these digital tools, but it's also important to understand how these impact one another and what those interdependencies are. Could you speak on this point further?
Yes, I think I'd probably say that I think this points to trying to base your standards on outcomes as far as possible so that you can allow for developments within the system to still happen, but you're delivering the same outcomes. You understand what you're trying to achieve, and if technology changes and allows you to achieve it in a different way or to manage your asset in a different way, still delivers the same outcome, then that's a good thing. And so I think it is important to try and, as far as possible, focus on those endpoints. You've got to accept, and this has come up a few times, the systems are going to be around for a long time to come. So often you might be making incremental changes to systems, and we've mentioned adaptation pathways quite a few times, but that's clearly a way to manage a lot of those changes that may happen in the time that you have. And also, though, you don't want to race ahead. We're talking about resilience here, and I was struck, I think it was Alison mentioned the Thames 2100 and the tideway barrier, and I was struck when I visited that some of the technology that relies on is now quite old, because it was well established proven technology at the time that the barrier was being developed, which we're going back to sort of the 60s and 70s in terms of development, even if it was constructed or finished in the 80s. And they're still satisfied that it's better to maintain the system that you've got because you understand how it performs, rather than necessarily keep trying to update it. So there is probably an argument for sometimes sticking with what you've got, if that's the best approach to managing a particular hazard or risk. I'll stop there and others come in.
Thank you so much, Ed. And I think Alison is back online. If I can come to you and pick your brain about the case studies in terms of integrating digital technologies and how we can think about that alongside a standards development timeline. Alison?
I think it's a really good question, and things are moving very rapidly in this space, and sometimes it's hard to keep up. I think there's a lot of different interesting work going on. There's the CREDO programme, which is a climate resilience demonstrator with the water and energy sectors, which I think if people went to and had a look at that, they would find really interesting in terms of the interdependencies work in resilience. There's a lot of different big research projects, one of which HS2 is involved in, called DARE, which is Decarbonised Adaptable Climate Resilient Transport for a Sustainable Future, if I'm remembering it correctly. They're doing quite a lot of work in this space, digital twins, that type of area. But I think, again, the question to me comes, how is this all being integrated together? And I think John and others have highlighted this. So I think there's a lot of really good work in this space. It would be good if we could bring that together somehow and use all of these various different projects, the projects that HS2 are doing, the one that I've spoken about already, and really try and sort of just understand what is being done more widely across infrastructure. One of the roles of the Infrastructure Operations Adaptation Forum that John chairs, that I'm co-founder, is to try and pull some of this together. But I think there is definitely a space in the UK for a body or somebody to bring a lot of this work together and to understand how it can all be used. Because it's all moving very fast, but how effective it's going to be in actually producing change and making everything more resilient, that's just a question that I still have.
These are all great questions, and I'm very happy to see that your mic is working, Alison. Let's dovetail now to a question we've received in terms of legacy assets, and this is a recurring issue. If we are building in resilient engineering requirements and design considerations for new build, we also have to think about our existing infrastructure. And new standards are being developed with climate science in mind, which is a very welcome development. But building out these expectations for resilience for new assets and projects, we also have to look back. How are we thinking about legacy assets being made more resilient, and how are they addressed in our standards landscape? John, maybe if I can come to you first on this question. You spoke directly about the value in being able to adapt infrastructure to maintain its serviceable life of that asset into the future. From your immense experience in our standards development work, what's your take on thinking about building resilience into our existing assets? How do standards provide for that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Abby. I'm thinking existing infrastructure. Most of the stuff out there is existing. We're not building too much new. And like I was saying earlier about railway infrastructure that I've worked on, it's knocking on to 200 years old, some of it. And in the UK, the base map of the railways was laid down by 1850 before any standards came along. All these earthworks, bridges, and tunnels were built by them. So one of the things I have here is that decision makers are key. Decision makers need to be apprised of the issues at stake in terms of managing legacy infrastructure. And I think a good tool to use is the ISO 55000 series on asset management, because if you use that standard, you end up with policies, strategies, and plans for everything to do with the infrastructure, which is really quite important. I'm a real fan of 55,000. I've got a week's training material as well for that, if anybody wants that, university lectures on that. But you need, for legacy infrastructure, we need to think about the system. And it's not just a case of thinking, oh, this is going to fall down, what do we do with it? Now, if there is an incident where something is damaged, then first of all, the thing I would say there is build back better. Don't just build back what was there because it's likely to flood again. Network Rail use this policy. I've seen it used in some places where lines have been flooded and they put the lines back and they've collapsed again in future years. And now they're putting in flood protection systems to stop embankments from being eroded. And I'm thinking also about things like planning renewals. All this legacy infrastructure goes through some sort of renewal cycle. Steel bridges that were built at the turn of the 19th and 20th century on the railway system probably being renewed just now, 100 years old. And when we rebuild them, we need to think future and future-proof them when rebuilding them. And to get into that, I mentioned the tailored guidance for standards writers. It can be helpful for standards users as well to look at what climate data is needed for designing for the future. And the adaptation pathway principles really help there as well. So there's a number of things there. When you're renewing an asset in the infrastructure, renew it and think about what it needs to be designed to withstand in terms of the future climate. Contingency planning, have contingency plans in place so that if something does happen, then the service is replaced, got working again rapidly, but with value for money in mind. Think long term, have disaster resilience plans ready, so as if something happens in a certain set of assets, do something that's sensible for the long term. Policies drive these, decision makers drive these. In doing all this, we need to think about sustainability as well. Don't just build everything in concrete because that's not helping. We've got to think about nature-based solutions. But I think the key 2 points here are things like when we're carrying out planned renewals, design them with the future in mind, using the tools we know about like adaptation pathways, and build back better if things are destroyed by a climate or weather event. Probably loads more as well, but that's enough for now.
Thank you, John. And Phil, just picking up on some points from your presentation, you've firsthand seen the issues with using outdated information, or information as you called it, that's past its use by date. When we are thinking about new build versus looking at infrastructure that's pre-existing, how can more up-to-date standards or more up-to-date data and information provide a better balancing between climate science and engineering requirements?
I'm obviously not an engineer, but I did start life as an accountant, unfortunately. And I think the challenge always is that there isn't enough money to replace everything that we may think that needs replacing. Ed made the point about the Thames. You keep using it because it works, and in a lot of cases that is, the right way to do it. We know that if I go back to the ice example within energy, we saw what happened in Shetland a few years ago when a load of the poles came down, and it was sort of one event that happened multiple times. It wasn't sort of a big event, and that was because you've got an awful lot of wooden poles in this country that were built before standards, but they've stayed up. So why replace them? and there's a cost to say, well, actually, at some point they're not going to stay up either because we don't know what's happening underneath the ground with them in terms of their foundations, or because they've just got to that point where they're weakened. But you can't change everything. So you need, and I go back to it in a way, you need to know the data. You need to obviously have data about where those poles are. You need to know when they were built. You need to know what sort of weather conditions they have survived. But also you need to figure out, well, and there's the guessing game, is what do you replace and what don't. And that's the problem sometimes. It doesn't matter what value data you've got, what great standards you've got, you can't replace everything. So there's a little bit, dare I say it, of well, where do we start? Which bits do we start with? Which bits are most at risk? And then you're looking back to Ed's point. It's about outputs, it's about impact. Especially in the energy sector, if a pole goes down, you lose power somewhere, and that can cause a bigger or lesser effect depending on where it is. So I think it's a complex game because there's never enough money around. And at the end of the day, if we had enough money, we'd solve the problem. There isn't enough money, so we have to plan. And then it's all about figuring out the best way of planning.
Absolutely. And on that point of the best way of planning and being most effective in terms of where you target your efforts, Alison, if I can come to you, you quite rightly pointed out that current extreme weather events and climate are already having an impact on current projects. What's your take on adaptation pathways and standardization and its potential role in boosting the resilience of not only new build, but sort of existing assets and projects?
The thing with adaptation pathways is that it's pathways, plural. So there's lots of different versions of the future. Lots of things are uncertain, lots of things we don't know. There's lots of climate variables that we haven't got great information about, for example. Or you might have a structure that you just don't know how it's going to perform over time, so you may need to monitor it. And adaptation pathways provide lots of different versions of how that feature can play out, and over time you can make decisions about where you're going to go with a particular asset or system based on how it performs, based on thresholds that you set, based on changes maybe that happen at different points, which is why I was saying when we looked at that at the sort of flow chart and it's circular, the adaptation pathways, you're going to come back to sort of decision points around that. That's why it's so powerful, I think. And so I'd say that adaptation pathways provide lots of versions of the future and lots of ways that we can future-proof it. They're not perfect, but they're a good way of sort of addressing some of these uncertainties that we have. And this is a playoff between how much money we've got, how much we want to spend, how much is going to be in the future. So, and they're perfect for both new infrastructure and for existing infrastructure that needs to be upgraded.
I think recognising the uncertainty of our current situation and taking in more information as it is available is something that seems to be a recurring focus of all of the presentations, which is good that we're all on the same page. Ed, if I can round off with you, in terms of retrofitting and adapting existing infrastructure, it's clear that it's very complex when we're thinking about trying to be climate resilient. And the NIC already recognises the differences in resilience for new build versus retrofitting existing infrastructure. Where do you see the principal role for standards to enhance the resilience of legacy assets and deliver maximum value?
I think other speakers have covered most of the points. I think it's particularly when there's an opportunity for renewal and building back better, so responding to actual incidents and rebuilding in a better way, but also taking that opportunity to meet the new standards when you're renewing infrastructure. But I guess for me, one of the keys is you've got to understand the performance of your current infrastructure. So others have already said it's about understanding what's happening to that now, but then in a dialogue with your regulator, understanding when you may reach that decision point that you've got to change what you're doing. And you do need, therefore, to be focused on the future and not over-focused on the past. And I think sometimes some of the regulatory frameworks are very focused on efficiency and events that have happened in the past and are not perhaps concentrating enough on things will be different in the future. And so you need to understand your assets rather than relying on historic trends, because climate change is likely to be bringing different pressures, more acute pressures in the future, and the historic performance may not be the best indicator of what might happen in the future. But if you've understood that asset better, you've got a better chance of making that decision, an informed decision at the right time to make a change where it's fundamentally needed.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I would like to thank both our panelists and our audience. We've had some really thoughtful questions, which we'll be following up after today's session as well. But this is not the end. This has been an incredibly rich discussion. I think it's really highlighted the importance of not only standardization, but informed policy development, and the importance of taking in new information as it is readily available. This conversation is just the beginning. As I said, we will be reaching out, updating you with additional information post-session. And for us, it's always important to encourage ongoing engagement with our standards development process. So if you do have any queries about any of the presentations or any of our current standards work for climate resilience, please feel free to reach out to myself or Claire. Now with that, I will pass over to my colleague Claire to wrap up the session, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you again to our speakers for your very insightful presentations.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, everybody. So, yeah, that's been a really good opening session for our week this morning. Lots and lots of takeaways. I think the importance of the role of government in this, but obviously industry as well, not least because of the high level of cost that's likely to be involved in thinking about resilience, but really the importance of the cost of not acting, not doing what's needed to be done, both for existing structures and obviously future new build infrastructure. You know, can we afford not to do it? I think not. And generally, agreement that data is hugely important, and the new data is going to be vital. I mean, yes, don't wait for perfection, but surely vital to use the most up-to-date information, data that we can get hold of. You know, because what might happen and what is actually happening, expectations can change, and the probabilities of what might happen can shift. But of course, we really do need to, you know, think about the standards, think about the outcome that we're trying to achieve, how we prioritize, you know, where is the highest impact, you know, where do we start? Really, just there is quite a lot to think about in this, and clearly the information on the existing standards was really helpful. We build on what there is already. You know, there is a lot of activity nationally, at European and international level. We need to think about applications specifically for infrastructure, and really building on that and targeting that in the different sectors. So yeah, a really good and interesting session. So I'm going to thank everybody. I'm going to just remind you all of the upcoming webinars that are taking place this week. They've been there up on your screen while I've been just talking now. So I won't go on any longer. We're finishing a little earlier perhaps than expected, but I think it's been enough. It was a very meaty session and a really good session. I apologise for some of the technical glitches this Monday morning, but I think we did hear from everybody, and they gave some really good talks. So thank you very much to Ed Beard from the NIC, to Phil Hodge from the Met Office, Alison Walker from HS2, John Dora from Climate Sense and the IOAF, and to Abby for chairing that really interesting panel session. So from me, Claire Price, thank you very much and have a good day. Thank you.